Thank you, everyone, for tuning in for the SAT Writing Language focus lesson led by Maggie again, who last week talked about the reading section. And she's now going to kind of move on to this section and explain the kind of differences and how you teach and approach the section, as well as getting to know the essay. So, Maggie, over to you.
Great. As I was just speaking about with Kayla before we all joined here together on the internet, it's difficult to teach this section because it's difficult to teach an entirety of grammar that you would theoretically learn over the course of your entire K through 12 education. But there are a couple of sort of general guidelines I think are helpful in terms of correcting grammar and just getting adjusted to the kinds of grammar and writing style that they prefer. I would say that beyond sort of a conventional grammar review with yourself, with your students, sort of going over the classics of comma usage, parts of speech, those kinds of things, there isn't as much that you can do beyond review and a little bit of instruction. It's not as strategy focused as the reading section is, but I do think that you can take solace in the fact, as well as your students can take solace in the fact that I find that this is the easiest section on which to quickly improve your score. Because it really is about rote repetition and just practicing certain skills and becoming adjusted to the ways that they prefer for you to write and express yourself, and in addition to the sort of more cut and dry sort of technical rules of grammar. So let's get started with a couple of the big ideas. The kicker with this one is the pace. You only have 35 minutes to do 44 questions. You are reading the entire passage. It is different. The structure of the section is different than when a lot of you who are probably teaching it as it was when you took the test. I know, for example, I didn't ever see things in sort of in context passages, and they were more standalone questions themselves. But now they organize things into 4 passages. I've seen one test where it has 5 passages that are sort of clump together different ideas, and it makes it easier for the SAT in this new design test that they rolled out, 2 years ago, to be able to build in some more writing logic and writing flow questions. So you've got 44 questions, generally 11 questions a passage. And instead of telling your students to think of, oh, it's 45 seconds per question, I would say that it's more helpful to think about doing 8 to 9 minutes for each passage. That gives them enough time to read the passage for at least basic comprehension, and to track the flow of the ideas, and then to be able to make the grammatical edits and the writing edits that are necessary to some of these truly strange passages that they find to place on the test. That's just sort of the general outline. The passages won't be too complex in terms of ideas, but they will almost always try to cloud the rather simple ideas in really, really clunky language. In their defense, this does reflect what a lot of college reading is like: simple ideas with a bunch of fancy words. But it's really just about being able to parse out the true heart of a sentence, the true heart of a paragraph, and be able to make little tweaks that can make these very strange and often incomprehensible passages make perfect sense. Strategy-wise, I think that these are piggybacking on the strategies that I would encourage you to encourage in your students for the reading, excuse me. So one of the cardinal rules of the last section is read the whole sentence, read the whole freaking sentence, where they have an underlined chunk, or in the reading section where they call back to a specific line. one of the first mistakes that you'll see students make is just reading, just reading the underlined section, so the underlined phrase, which is what they're trying to get you to edit, but that's within the context of a greater sort of, I don't know, ecosystem of the sentence, if that makes sense. So I'd say for grammatical issues, for the little questions where they've just underlined 4 words and then they'll have a bunch of different ways to say that with different contractions, different commas, punctuation, little words changed, that kind of thing. Focus on the whole sentence and try to articulate what isn't working. Then with the whole paragraph, that's what makes it difficult. The whole paragraph, you really do need to read the whole thing for at least the most basic comprehension. There will be your students will have an impulse to just skim, because there will be 3 or 4 sentences where they don't have a particular underlined chunk, and it looks like, you know, it's this no man's land that they're trying to get you lost in, but there actually are important bits of information that do shape the structure of the passage. And so I think just as long as you are doing some reading of those sentences in between, and that whole passage, it'll pay off once you get to those logic and writing questions that are more likely to be placed later in the passage or later in the sequence of the questions. And then read the whole passage, same idea. Paragraph and passage are sort of part and parcel with each other with this section. This is something else that I spoke about a little bit with the reading section, and I do think that it's helpful here, is to anticipate what you think the right answer would be. Literally cover it up with your hands. That's not even it feels goofy, but it's quite useful, actually. To think, oh, I'm reading this sentence to myself. I don't know what exactly is wrong with it, but I'm getting a little stuck. Here's this underlined chunk. I'm going to restate it to myself in my head. How would Maggie rewrite it? If I were sitting next to a friend editing their paper, how would I rewrite it? And that can really help you figure out what parts of speech you're looking for, what isn't working about it, can tell you what your answer will give you the opportunity to line their responses, their 4 possible responses, up with your personal response, which just eliminates a lot of potential error and silliness. I rant a little bit. I ranted a little bit about this in the previous session. Oh, I have a typo here. So now I need to take the test more, I guess. Just read all of the choices. You will be banging your head against the wall with the number of times that your students will just look at A and say, that sounds pretty good, and so do I. It will drive you crazy, and this is just my trying to help you prepare for that. Help them read all the choices, all of them, and consider them all equally. At least 75% of the answers are going to be incorrect, and your students will jump at the first half passable option that they can find. So focusing on coming up with your own anticipation of what the answer is, and then going through all 4 choices and giving them their proper due is just kind of non-negotiable with this section. In terms of what the SAT values, and we'll talk about this more in the essay, and talked about it last week with the reading, excuse me. All they care about is conciseness and clarity. They do not care about you having the most sophisticated idea on the planet. They do not care about, the best cited, best expressed, super, super complex ideas. They care about taking something that's relatively complex and boiling it down into something consumable, something that's clear and straightforward. So when they're asking for different ways to word things, I would say that your first impulse is the first thing you should listen to. And then if you are narrowing it down to two choices, a lot of the time it's going to be whatever is a little bit briefer, whatever's more concise. That's exactly what they value. Awesome. Let's go over the first passage. What fun. I'm going to try and figure out how to do this in my computer. Here we go. Boop. Ha ha ha. I tried to make little drawings and notes of what I was thinking as we were going through. So I do think that this this passage, although that clearly there's some sort of weird ordination issue, where they just like forgot how to put numbers in a Word document, I guess. Sort of going through sequentially. I'm just going to operate under the assumption that everyone has this in front of them. If not, you can just zoom in here. So the first passage, it's about natural light in the workplace. Truly, who are these people? What do they spend their time doing? These are the kinds of topics that they pick. But, you know, to each their own. So the first thing that people struggle with when they're adjusting to the very particular grammar rules of this test is that generally in most schools, people don't learn the Oxford comma anymore, or the series comma, or their Harvard comma, I think you can also call it. The SAT loves the Oxford comma because, of course, they do. As a true believer in the Oxford comma myself, I am delighted by this. So studies have shown that employees are happier, healthier, and more productive when they work in an environment, blah, 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 blah. Because we have the comma after both happier and healthier before our third item, more productive, it is perfectly good as it is. Yeah, commas are hard, but the Oxford comma, once you get adjusted to it, ain't too bad. Our second question, I just crossed out the little fake numbers on here. Not sure what's happening. When they work in an environment in which temperatures are carefully controlled, which choice provides the most appropriate introduction to the passage? So the first impulse that a lot of your students are going to have with a question like this is they're going to say, oh, well, that's grammatically correct. Sure, yeah, I mean, in which the temperature isn't fluctuating, that sounds like a great situation. And they are going to try to rush through to the next question. But if they skim ahead a little bit, they know that it's going to have something to do with natural light. And they can also get that from the title of the passage, which can be surprisingly useful at times. Shed some light on the workplace. I can scroll down a little bit and say, increasing the amount of natural light is a good investment for employees and employers. So I know that I'm anticipating that's what my little purple things are, or my comments as I was taking it. I was like, okay, I need to be something about natural light. So if I go through in which temperatures are carefully controlled, that affords them adequate amounts of natural light, that is thoroughly sealed to prevent energy loss, or in which they feel comfortable asking managers for special accommodations. I'm sure that A, C, and D are all accurate. I'm sure that there could be some kind of study on those things, but anything besides B would be functioning as a non sequitur, even if it doesn't appear that way at the beginning of the paragraph. Let's go on to the next one. All right. For one thing, lack of exposure to natural light has a significant impact on employees' health. A study conducted in 2013 by Northwestern University in Chicago showed that inadequate natural light could result in eye strain, headaches, and fatigue, as well as interference with the body's circadian rhythms. At this point, the writer is considering adding the following sentence. Workers in offices with windows sleep an average of 46 minutes more per night than workers in offices without windows. Okay, that sounds interesting. That sounds relevant to the passage, but we have to jump ahead and look to see what the next sentence is. Circadian rhythms, which are controlled by the body's biological clocks. So I know that our next sentence is about circadian rhythms, so I know that this sentence is not helpful. I'll go down to my no options. No, because it interrupts the discussion of circadian rhythms, or no, because it does not take into account whether workers were exposed to sunlight outside of the office. D, if we were going down that you sleep more if you have windows in your office route, that could be plenty interesting. And you'll be stunned by how many students will kind of, they'll get swept up in it. They'll start getting interested and start reading, which is great. And that's something we should encourage elsewhere, just not necessarily in this context. The next one, that's how we get to C. Circadian rhythms, which are controlled by the body's biological clocks, influence body temperature, hormone release, cycles of sleep and wakefulness, and other bodily functions. Okay, so these rhythms are controlled by the clocks, by the biological clocks which belong to the body. Based on that principle, I know that I'm going to need to have the clocks to not be possessive, but to be possessed by the body, which is how I end up with body apostrophe S, biological clocks. If anyone would like me to sort of explain the possessive and plural and contraction things, just let me know. I know that's probably a throwback to an era in which you all were being drilled on grammar more frequently than you are now in your actual adult lives. Otherwise, I can just keep rolling along. Like any other health problems, these ailments can increase employee absenteeism, which in turn is costly for employers. I think that your students are going to kind of get tripped up on this kind of thing because they will think that the problems are costly for employers, but can increase employee absenteeism, which in turn is costly for employers. This is one where absenteeism is just its own formal noun, and so we don't need to change anything because it's just one thing. Is costly for employers. You could have it be C or D in terms of tense, but is functionally the same thing as is. It's just longer and clunkier. So that's one where you can knock out option C just based on the value of conciseness that they have, and have been costly for employers. We would have no context to understand why it would have been costly for employers in the past. We don't have any data that we're being presented with to know that it has been that in the past, which is how we end up with is. Great, let's see the next one. Employees who feel less than 100% and are sleep deprived are also less prone to work at their maximal productivity. Woo, need more coffee. One company in California gained a huge boost in its employees' morale when it moved from an artificially lit distribution facility to one with natural illumination. Which choice best supports the statement made in the previous sentence? The previous sentence, employees who feel less than 100% and are sleep deprived are also less prone to work at their maximal productivity. So my little note to myself was like, okay, I'm looking for something about increased productivity. And only one of these options will give me that. This is sort of how this anticipation strategy really works in the writing and language section as well as in the reading section. Excellent. Woohoo. Artificial light sources are also costly aside from lowering worker productivity. They typically constitute anywhere from 25 to 50% of a building's energy use. In context, which choice best combines the underlying sentences? So when I am given that sort of prompt of in context, that gives me an automatic orientation towards looking at the, not an orientation, that gives me a cue to look at the sentence before and the sentence after. So the sentence before, one company in California saw a 5% increase in productivity when it moved from an artificially lit distribution facility to one with natural illumination. So natural illumination, great for productivity. After this combined Uber sentence, we're going to have, when a plant in Seattle, Washington was redesigned for more natural light, the company was able to enjoy annual electricity cost reductions of $500,000 a year. So I'm trying to, with these two sentences, combining them, I'm also trying to bridge the gap between the idea of productivity and savings. So artificial light sources are also costly aside from lowering worker productivity. They typically constitute anywhere from 25 to 50% of a building's energy use. So I know sort of logically that I'm trying to combine the second sentence into the idea of its costliness in the first sentence. So if I were to just cover, you can't see my hand. I don't know, I thought you could see that. I am going like this over it. So I'm thinking, how would I combine these two sentences? Artificial light sources are also costly aside from lowering worker productivity. They typically constitute anywhere from 25 to 50% of a building's energy use. I would probably say, aside from lowering worker productivity, artificial light sources are costly and typically constitute anywhere from 25 to 50% of a building's energy use. So I have my own rationalization. I have my own sense of what I think it should be. And now I'm just going to try to get them to line up with my brain. Of course, getting your students to trust their own instincts is a whole nother ball of wax, but it'll pay off a lot. I promise you. So I look through these possible options, and I have almost word for word on A what I thought it would be. Slightly different, but very close. So the costs of artificial lights, let's go through the other options and see about why they wouldn't be correct. The cost of artificial light sources, aside from lowering worker productivity, typically constitutes anywhere from 25 to 50% of a building's energy use. In terms of logic of sentence, I'm splitting up the cost and the detail about the cost with a sidebar about worker productivity. That's just not clear and concise writing. Typically constituting 25 to 50% of a building's energy use, artificial light sources lower worker productivity and are costly. So this is the same thing. All of a sudden I have lower worker productivity splitting up the description of its costliness and the detail of its costliness. And also, if I'm going to have this kind of descriptive clause at the beginning, I'm going to want to apply to the entire action of the main clause, so the sentence that follows. And typically constituting 25 to 50% doesn't have much bearing on worker productivity. Artificial lights, which lower worker productivity and are costly, typically constitute anywhere from 25 to 50% of a building's energy use. So this takes a main idea that it's costly and sort of sidelines it in favor of a detail, if that makes sense. This is kind of about relationship information relationships. The detail of 25 to 50% is secondary to it being costly. And so the structure of the sentence needs to mirror that as well. Excellent. Let's do the next one. When a plant in Seattle, Washington was redesigned for more natural light, the company was able to enjoy annual electricity cost reductions of $500,000 each year. So there are two great ways to write this sentence. Was able to enjoy annual electricity cost reductions of 500,000, or was able to enjoy electricity cost reductions of 500,000 each year. But because annual is not underlined, I underlined it for my own purposes here, because annual is already baked into the sentence, we need to adjust so that it's not too redundant. So that is how I came to conclude that D, we already have annual, which means every year. So we don't need to reiterate that. We don't need to hit them over the head with that much information. Clarity, conciseness, no redundancy. It's all they love. Let's move on to the last couple of questions. Among the possibilities to reconfigure a building's lighting is the installation of full pane windows to allow the greatest degree of sunlight to reach office interiors. Thus, businesses can install light tubes. These are pipes placed in workplace roofs to capture and funnel sunlight down into a building's interior. So if I'm to skip looking at the responses, and I'm just looking at this myself, if I were imagining this is just some sort of piece of copy I was given and I'm going over it with my green pen or whatever, I would think, okay, so I'm in my first sentence, I'm presented this option of the full pane windows. It's a great option. You know, you can envision how it works really clearly. And then businesses can install light tubes. I have to figure out what the relationship between that information is. Full pane windows, light tubes. If I think that hard enough to myself, I'll know that those are two different options that can achieve the same end. So if I'm going to try to replace thus with something, which is not a word that indicates any kind of two different option relationship, I would say, another option is if businesses can install light tubes. I would say, maybe if light tubes are cheaper, I could be like, if you're looking for a cheaper alternative, something like that. So when I look at the potential actual options, I know thus indicates some sort of A, therefore B relationship. Nevertheless is A, but despite that B. Alternatively is A and also B. And finally is A long last B. So only one of these will give me the kind of information relationship that I'm looking for, which is how I end up at C. This is a hard one because we've got two in the same sentence. So I do think that I can answer this one by just reading the first half of the sentence, number 9, I mean, but that's not always going to be the case. So just go ahead and read the whole sentence, read the sentence before, read the sentence after. You'll thank me for it one day down the road. So alternatively, businesses can install light tubes, pipes placed in workplace roofs to capture and funnel sunlight down into a building's interior. So I know that the pipes, blah, 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 into a building's interior is somehow related to the light tubes. And so because light tubes isn't something we just talk about in our normal lives, I'm going to guess that this is the definition. So I'm going to just hide the answers for myself again. If I'm thinking, okay, I'm covering this with my hands. Thus, businesses can install light tubes. If I were to write this myself, I'd say light tubes, which are a kind of pipe, blah, 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 something like that. Or businesses can install light tubes or other kinds of pipes placed in workplace roofs, that kind of thing. So if I'm looking for that information relationship, I could say businesses can install light tubes, comma, they are pipes placed in workplace roofs to capture and funnel sunlight down into a building's interior. That would be a run-on sentence using a comma splice is the term that I found the kids are learning in school a lot today, which is basically just putting a comma where a period should be, or a semicolon. But we can take the second clause and turn it into a dependent clause by using a word like which. So they are both going to end up with comma spliced sentences, a comma spliced sentence more accurately. So if I'm down to which are and those being, which is cleaner, more concise, and more to the point. Light tubes, which are pipes. Just go straight to it. And those being is very, very awkward. And it's just the information doesn't flow cleanly. Glass walls and dividers can also be used to replace solid walls as a means something distributing natural light more freely. Okay. Hide my little things from myself. I think glass walls and dividers can also be used to replace solid walls as a means blank distributing natural light more freely. I'm going to come up with a couple of different answers for myself. As a means by which natural light is distributed more freely. What's something that I can say here? A means through, almost, close. I'll consider it, but I'll see, do I have a better option that can achieve the same thing? I have of, yay, a means of distributing. That I read that and I know that sounds so much better. Awesome. Does anyone have any questions about these kinds of things? Any technical things, particular questions you struggled with? I'm going to pull up the chat thing so that you guys can send in messages without having to talk to me too much. Questions are great.
I wouldn't mind if you could review really quickly the Oxford comma thing again. Just
great, yeah, absolutely. Not everyone is as much of a punctuation nerd as I am, and I need to remember that sometimes. So the Oxford comma is it used to be this debate between sort of American writers and English writers, thus the Oxford, which I believe is where they sort of enshrined it into grammar law, something like that. So an Oxford comma is generally referred to in school now as a series comma, because it is about a list of 3 different things or more. So if I were saying, I'm going to the store and I'm going to buy apples, bananas, and oranges. If I were writing in a non-Oxford comma style list, I would say bananas, comma, apples, and oranges. But because, and that is sort of stylistically right. But with the Oxford comma or the series comma, you break up all the different things so that I could say, I'm going to buy, this is not as good of an example now. I'm going to bring I'm trying to think of a phrase that would have an and in it. If I'm listing book publishers, I'm going to invite Random House, comma, Simon and Schuster, comma, blah, 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 blah. I could keep making a list forever. So if you have the Oxford comma can give you room to pair different things together within a list, if that makes sense. And it also means that you're breaking up all the different things that you're putting in a line together. I'm going to pull up. Oh, yay, Robert. Woo. So the way that the Oxford comma plays out in this question is employees are happier, healthier, and more productive. Short, practice sections, little videos, and a bunch of different practice problems that, especially if you're feeling a little bit shaky on the grammar, can be really, really helpful. It's also a resource that I encourage you to share with your students. So the essay is one of the sections of the SAT that perhaps inspires the most terror, because it is the genre of writing required from it is such a genre that is expected of college students and is really not the kind of writing that most of your students will be accustomed to doing in their usual high school classes. Of course, it is not required. It's not factored into your overall score out of 1,600. It is only required by some of the most elite schools. So the Ivies, all of the UC campuses, those are probably the main schools that you'll deal with that require the essay. But it is recommended by most every competitive and highly selective school. So especially for your higher scoring students, I would encourage you to recommend the essay to them 100%. One downside is that when New York City Public Schools administers the test, they don't administer the essay. So that's just something to prepare for when your students are preparing to take it in school and in YCPS. They'll have to prep for the essay on another test date. The essay is 50 minutes long, which is quite brief for the amount of writing and thinking that goes into it. Your students that will probably perform best on this are the ones who have taken the AP Language and Composition test, which I believe is 45-minute essays of a similar sort of analytical genre. Speaking of that, the essay is on the SAT, unlike on the ACT, is completely an analysis of how a writer builds an argument. It is not about anyone's personal opinion. It is not about making an argument yourself. It's about deconstructing and being able to name the different elements and strategies used by the writer to assess the efficacy of the essay. The content will generally be so persuasive nonfiction is, I think, the best description I could come up with for it. Some of that is really strong political writing, sort of persuasive writing politically. Otherwise, you'll see op-eds from the New Yorker and New York Times. The political writing is generally a little bit older, but don't let that lull you into a sense of complacency. For example, one of the previously administered essays, and now a practice prompt that you can use with your students, they're all on the College Board Essay website. One of the previous prompts was an essay written by Dr. King about his opposition to the Vietnam War. Because that was a little bit further in the past, I had assumed that there would be a greater level of unanimity on what students thought about that, but I've had more than one student who responded a little bit, who just responded differently to the political content in that than I was anticipating. So that's just something to be on the lookout for and to prep your students for. They're going to have strong emotional responses to some of these essay prompts, And it really is about quieting that voice inside yourself and looking at it from a purely analytical standpoint. One other essay that I think is actually a great practice prompt to do with yourself or to assign to your students is, and I think it's an op-ed written by Jimmy Carter about ANWR, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and why he opposes drilling there. This is, a very contemporary political issue, even though it's being written by someone that your students might not have a particular political of a response to, since, it's been a while since he was president. But he definitely writes more in the style, I think, of persuasive nonfiction in that essay, as opposed to pure political writing. So he, I think, bridges that divide well, and that's I think it's an excellent prompt to start with when you're prepping your students, because it covers a little bit of those two categories. Otherwise, the content will really be about sort of big issues, and it's about taking a stand. The prompts in the essays will be about taking stands on certain issues. Your response as the writer is not to have your own stance, but to analyze how that stance is constructed. This is terrifying to a lot of students, but for the ones who are the most freaked out, just remind them of the glories of the 5-paragraph essay. They're really, really helpful. And I've seen some really butt-kicking 5-paragraph essays on the SAT that I think would score really highly. Some of your students who are a little bit more ambitious might want to go for a 6 or 7-paragraph essay, but they're more looking for consistency throughout. So I think if you have more to say, if you have a 4th body paragraph in you, go for it, but that's not going to be the norm. In terms of the actual argument you construct, I think that your thesis statement is basically the structure of the essay for this kind of thing. I would say, pick 3 or 4 elements or elements of rhetoric or persuasive tactics that the author uses, and use those, paragraph by paragraph to go through the essay. I personally like doing ethos, pathos, and logos because they're pretty straightforward, and if you're able to sort them into those 3 categories, then you're good to go. Probably since you aren't as much of a nerd as I am, and you haven't been talking about those terms since high school. Ethos is the ethic of the writer, sort of the credibility of the writer. So if Jimmy Carter is saying, "Hey, I'm friends with these other presidents, and they agree with me," that validates his credibility as the author. Pathos is emotional appeals. So like the really illustrious imagery about the caribou and ANWR and blah, 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 blah. That would be a pretty direct appeal to your emotions, or use of pathos. And then logos is rational thought, facts, data, hard numbers, that kind of thing. Those are always some good ones. I think counter-argument is always a great one. I'd say put that a little bit later. I think just in terms structurally, it's a bit strongest as a 3rd body or 4th body paragraph, but that's my personal taste as well. Some students will want to say, like, they use imagery, and then they use imagery about the nature, they use data about drilling, and Jimmy Carter's personal expertise to bolster his argument, that kind of thing. I think that keeping things focused on the writer and the way that the writer builds the argument, as opposed to, the reader, is always strongest. But these are also things that will be formally assessed in their rubric. So the way that the essay is graded is a little bit it's a little hard to adjust to, unlike the other sections where it's you get one wrong and then you don't get the points. The essay is graded on a scale of 1 to 8 on 3 different fronts, so it's out of a total score of 24. So 1 to 8, it's on the reading, the analysis, and the writing itself. So the reading is, did you understand what was going on in the passage? Do you get it? The analysis is, what did you take from it? You know, what is the construction of your argument about why they made this argument well, if that makes sense. So the elements that you select, the examples that you select in your essay, that kind of thing. And then writing is about the actual technical writing of it. So are there a lot of punctuation errors and incomplete sentences, and is there formal diction? You know, are there fancy words, for lack of a more elegant term? Or you could also say formal diction, but that will freak your students out probably. Then those 3 scores are, each grader gives a score of 1 to 8 on each of those fronts. There are generally 2 graders, so one of them will give, you know, oh, this is okay, I'm going to give them a 5 on blah, 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 and a 6 on blah, 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 and a 7 on blah, blah, blah. So then I would end up with, 18 out of 24, but then the other person ended up with them as 16 out of 24. You average the 2, and the student will receive a 17 out of 24. It feels strangely, I think that the grades that people get can feel strangely depressed, sort of artificially low, but that's true of the out of 800 score as well. So just remind your students of that. I'm trying to think of the other basic elements. That's, for the most part, the construction of the essay. It is an analytical essay. It's not about the student's own point of view. It's about an analysis of how a writer builds an argument. And once you get over that hurdle with your students, the whole essay process becomes a lot easier. All right, thank you. Hope you all enjoyed the writing and language section, and if you have any questions on the essay, just let me know. Resources that I think are helpful are really the College Board website. They have a bunch of the prompts that they've given in recent years. Highly recommend doing a couple of those yourself, just to get a sense, and if you want my help with figuring out how the grading works, that kind of thing, just let me know. Thank you all so much, and talk to you next week about the ACT. Bye!